pp. Elsewhere, in northern Peru, the spectacular discovery of a royal tomb made worldwide headlines in 1987. Dating to about 250 CE, it was found in the area of Sipan and was excavated by a Peruvian archaeologist named Walter Alva. This was the region where the Moche culture flourished from 100 to 800 CE. The kingdom of the Moche was large by Andean standards, located in a north-south strip by the coast. It was an area of about 350 miles long by 50 miles wide, covering a dozen narrow valleys descending out of the Andes toward the Pacific coast and separated by desert. The Moche traded widely with regions along the coast and over the Andes in the Amazon rainforest, in what is now modern Chile and Ecuador, for goods including lapis lazuli and spondylus shells, as well as boa constrictors, parrots, and monkeys. They supported themselves using irrigation canals to grow crops such as corn, avocados, potatoes, and peanuts. From the ocean they got fish, shrimp, crabs, and other seafood. Their society seems to have been highly stratified, with arts such as textile weaving, impressive ceramics, and items crafted from precious metals, though they had no writing system and apparently didn't use money as we know it. They also worked hard at construction projects, not only the irrigation canals, but also pyramids, temples, and elaborate burial mounds. One pyramid, near the capital city on the Moche River by the modern city of Trujillo and called the Pyramid of the Sun, was 296 Chapter 17. Built from more than 130 million mud bricks. It covered more than 5 hectares, which is about 12 acres. An administrative structure, it is thought to be the largest construction ever built in South America. The other side of the capital city featured the slightly smaller Pyramid of the Moon, which was highly decorated and used for ceremonial purposes. The Moche civilization suddenly collapsed about 800 CE. We don't know exactly why it happened. Theories range from a devastating earthquake to a severe drought caused by an El Niño weather system. By the time the Spanish arrived in the area centuries later, all they found were the weather-beaten and melted remains of the mud brick pyramids and other buildings that the Moche had left behind. It was in 1987 that Walter Alva got a call from a local police station near Sipan. Several tomb robbers had had a falling out after finding a wealthy tomb and were fighting over the objects that they found. Rather ironically, one of them called the police for help. The police confiscated the objects and called Alva. When he arrived at the police station, one of the officers reached into a paper bag and then pulled a small gold mask out of it. Alva nearly fell off his chair in surprise. He took a team of archaeologists back to where the robbers said they had found the tomb, which turned out to be located in an absolutely huge pyramid made of mud bricks. The pyramid, which is one of several at the site, was so damaged by erosion and other mostly natural forces that it almost looked more like a natural mountain than something constructed by humans. Alva hoped that there might be other tombs that the looters had missed, so he and his team began a proper excavation. Soon they did indeed find several other tombs, including one that turned out to be what National Geographic has called the New World's richest unlooted tomb. This is Tomb 1, the tomb belonging to the Lord of Sipan, as he is called. In the tomb, which is basically a large room measuring about 5 meters by 5 meters, they first found the body of a man whose feet had been cut off. This was possibly to prevent him from walking away in the afterlife, so that he had to stay to protect the other occupants. He was buried in the upper right corner of the burial chamber, a few feet above the rest of the bodies. Lines eye in the sand, cities eye in the sky 297. The Lord of Sipan himself was found in the middle of the chamber, with additional burials on all sides of him. Counting the man whose feet had been cut off, there may have been as many as 11 people in the tomb besides the Lord himself, 3 other adult men, 1 adult woman, 3 adolescent boys and 3 adolescent girls, and 1 child. More than 450 objects were buried in this one tomb, many of precious metal, including gold and silver, as well as others of copper or bronze now oxidized to a pleasant green color. Among them are necklaces with beads in the shape of what look like peanuts, including one that has silver peanuts on one side and gold peanuts on the other. Because we know that the Moche cultivated peanuts, we shouldn't be surprised to see them represented in jewelry. There are also 3 pairs of earrings, or ear ornaments, including one set with an animal inlaid on them who looks a bit like Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer. Another set has a bird that looks like a cross between a duck and a pelican. A third set has what appears to be a three-dimensional representation of the Lord of Sippin himself, all dressed up and ready to go, complete with spear or scepter, shield, ear ornaments, and a necklace of what look like skulls that goes from shoulder to shoulder. If he wore this last set of ear ornaments as part of his outfit when he was all dressed up, then he'd be wearing a miniature of himself, which is intriguing. On his chest were hundreds of tiny beads still in place, forming a magnificent pectoral collar of green, brown, and white. These had to be painstakingly preserved and conserved. Often the way to recover such artifacts intact is to put some sort of easily removable glue onto cloth, cardboard, or some other material, and then lay it on top of the beads while they are still in place and allow the whole assembly to dry. Then it is lifted up and the beads come with it, still in their original place and with the original design intact, though it's now a mirror image. It can then be transported safely to a conservation room or elsewhere, where the glue can be dissolved and the original pectoral collar, with all of the beads still in place, can be safely studied and worked on some more. There was also a huge crescent-shaped helmet or headdress made of gold, with feathers that probably went with it, also possibly a faceplate. 298 Chapter 17. Made of gold, to cover the lower part of the Lord's face, and what is probably a scepter or a goblet made of gold. There are also several backflaps made in silver, gold, and bronze or copper. These were worn, as the name suggests, as part of the backside of the outfit, most likely covering the Lord's rear end. On several of these the so-called decapitator god is pictured, standing on what looks like a row of skulls. He is found on other objects in the tomb as well. Although small, this is not a god whom one would want to meet in a dark alley. Other representations, presumably of other gods, are equally ferocious looking, including some with open mouths and lots of sharp-pointed teeth, but there are also small gold beads in the shape of faces with inlaid blue eyes that aren't as scary to look at. As for who this important person in the tomb was, most specialists such as Christopher Donnan, in addition to Walter Alva, have suggested that he may have been the warrior priest who is known from pictorial scenes that have been found on moche pots and painted on murals. One of the most famous themes is the so-called sacrifice ceremony. In this ceremony, sacrificial victims have their throats cut, their blood is poured or drained into goblets, and the priests and other participants then drink it. The warrior priest is always shown wearing things like a helmet and headdress, backflaps, and ear ornaments and carrying a large goblet or scepter, just like the Lord of Sippin has in his tomb. If that is the case, then the scenes that are portrayed on the pottery and in the murals apparently represent real-life events and real people. There are numerous other moche sites that have been investigated during the past several decades, and they have yielded important artifacts and information. The tomb of the Lord of Sippin remains among the best known, however, which has unfortunately resulted in large-scale attempts at looting by would-be tomb robbers looking for another rich burial nearby. At least one aerial photograph shows that the region by Sippin now looks like a moonscape, with pits dug absolutely everywhere. Obviously, this is one of the areas of the world where we have to be proactive in the future to prevent such looting activities. PPPP. Lines eye in the sand, cities eye in the sky. 299. Moving now a bit closer to us in time, to about 1500 CE, and back down to the southern part of Peru directly east from the region of the Nazca Lines, we reach Machu Picchu, which was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1983. The site of Machu Picchu is spectacular, like few others in the world. It lies at an altitude of 7,972 feet above sea level. The views are quite literally breathtaking, in part because at that altitude, it's literally hard to catch your breath. In fact, many tourists suffer from altitude sickness while they are there, which can adversely affect the visit. By way of comparison, the official elevation of Denver is 5,280 feet above sea level, and so Machu Picchu could legitimately be nicknamed the mile-and-a-half high city. The site dates back to a little more than 500 years ago. It was first built during the 15th century, about 1450 CE, and was abandoned less than a century later, around 1532 CE, at the time of the Spanish conquest. Built at the direction of one of the Inca emperors as a summer refuge and a secondary palace, it is 5 days' walk from Cuzco, the Inca capital. It is placed atop a large mountain with lush vegetation and a 2,000-foot drop to the river below. At one end of the site rises a peak, Huayna Picchu, a popular climb for more adventurous tourists. New scholarly projects are continuing at the site. Machu Picchu. 300 Chapter 17. Including one that will be testing the DNA of skeletal remains found there. Hiram Bingham, who was a professor at Yale, gets credit for the discovery of Machu Picchu, which was first brought to the attention of the world in 1911. As a recent great book by Mark Adams, Turn Right at Machu Picchu, points out, Bingham didn't really discover the city, since he was basically just shown it by the locals, who had always known it was there. He might not even have been the first Western explorer to find it. But he claimed credit for it, and that's certainly not the first time such a thing has happened. Heinrich Schliemann did the same thing at Mycenae in Greece about 40 years earlier, when the locals took him to the ruins of the Lion Gate at the ancient city, and at Troy, when he took over Frank Calvert's work there. Bingham returned to the site in 1912, sponsored by both National Geographic and Yale University, and excavated there for about 4 months, even though he had no real formal training as an archaeologist. In 1913, National Geographic devoted their entire April issue to Machu Picchu. Some see that issue, and the National Geographic Society's association with Bingham, as the beginning of its rise to the international prominence that it still enjoys today. In that article, Bingham tried to convey some of the wonder of the initial discovery, writing, "We found ourselves in the midst of a tropical forest, beneath the shade of whose trees we could make out a maze of ancient walls, the ruins of buildings made of blocks of granite, some of which were beautifully fitted together in the most refined style of Inca architecture. A few rods farther along we came to a little open space, on which were 2 splendid temples or palaces. The superior character of the stonework, the presence of these splendid edifices, and of what appeared to be an unusually large number of finely constructed stone dwellings, led me to believe that Machu Picchu might prove to be the largest and most important ruin discovered in South America since the days of the Spanish conquest." Additional excavations took place in 1914 and 1915, and then Bingham began writing books and articles about his discoveries, of which probably the most famous is Lost City of the Incas. He thought that Machu Picchu might have been the lost Inca city of Vilcabamba, but that is now thought to be located elsewhere. Looking out over the site itself, one can see that it is split into an upper town and a lower town. There is a residential district, presumably Lines Eye in the Sand, City's Eye in the Sky 301, where the regular people lived. There also is what seems to be a royal district, possibly for the nobles or royalty, which is distinctly possible if the whole site was used as a royal retreat, like a Camp David for Inca rulers. And then there are temples, warehouses, channels for water, and lots of agricultural terraces. Within the so-called Temple of the Sun, there is also a massive tower known as the Torian, which was possibly used as an observatory. A large stone called the Intihuatana might be a ritual stone used to mark winter and summer solstices, but whether that was its use also is debated. All these buildings were constructed using the standard, or classic, Inca technique. The stones were cut and fitted together so well that there was no need to use any mortar to bind or seal them together. Most of the doors and windows are neither square nor rectangular, but rather trapezoidal. Obviously, this was a deliberate architectural feature, and some people have suggested that it was to help prevent the buildings from collapsing during an earthquake, which is an interesting idea. Bingham brought a lot of artifacts back to Yale from Machu Picchu after his excavations at the site in 1912 and 1914-1915. He was supposed to hold them for only 18 months so that experts in the United States could study them. In fact, they remained at Yale for the next 90 years. It was only when the wife of the Peruvian president, who was an anthropologist herself, began agitating for their return that anything was done about it. The first few objects were returned in 2006, and by 2012 pretty much all the artifacts had been sent back to Peru, except for those that both sides agreed should stay at Yale for further study. The objects that were returned are now displayed in a museum and research center in Cusco, where both local and foreign archaeologists and students can study them. They include ceramic bottles decorated with highly intricate designs, some of which will have been used to hold oil or perfume. One has a human face on the long neck of the bottle, with what looks like a flounced skirt on the body of the vessel. Another is in the shape of a hand holding an elongated cup. There also is a pin for a shawl, which is made of bone and features 2 birds facing each other, as well as various pieces of jewelry and other metal objects, including ceremonial knives. PPPP. 302 Chapter 17. We'll end our brief survey of archaeology in Peru here, having noted some amazing cultures, the Nazca, the Moche, and the Inca, and covered several thousand years and hundreds of square miles of territory, from the deserts to the mountains. We can clearly see the rise and fall of distinctive civilizations, each occupying the same general region one after the other, here in the New World just like in the Old World. In some ways, though, the developments here in Peru are almost more impressive, set as they are in a landscape of enormous mountains and isolated valleys, coastal streams separated by desert, and the Amazon basin nearby, which combine to make it a much harder place in which to develop a large complex society, garner agricultural surpluses, maintain communication between various parts of the polity, and so on. Regardless, it seems that the cycle of history is not so different, whether studying the Moche or Mesopotamia, the Inca or the Indus Valley, the Nazca or New Kingdom Egypt. Ati, the site of Teotihuacan, inhabited from about 100 BC to about 650 CE in a region approximately 50 kilometers northeast of Mexico City, a secret tunnel was detected in 2003. It led from one of the plazas near the edge of the city to the Temple of the Feathered Serpent and was found after heavy rains opened up a small hole about 80 feet away from the temple. Archaeologists brought remote sensing devices, specifically radar, and then mapped it. Led by Mexican archaeologist Sergio Gomez, excavation has been going on ever since, using remote-controlled robots in some places and pure hand labor in others. The tunnel is more than 330 feet long, ending at least 40 and perhaps as many as 60 feet directly below the temple. It was sealed about 1800 years ago with at least 6 walls deployed to block the tunnel at various points along its length. During their 1-8 giant heads, feathered serpents, and golden eagles. 304 Chapter 18. Meticulous excavations in the tunnel, archaeologists have found more than 70,000 ancient objects as diverse as jewelry, seeds, animal bones, seashells, pottery, obsidian blades, vessels with animal heads, rubber balls such as were used in the Mesoamerican ball games, hundreds of large conch shells from the Caribbean, and 4,000 wooden objects. The tunnel ceiling and walls are coated with a glittery powder, perhaps ground-up pyrite or a similar substance, which would have caused them to sparkle and shimmer in the light of torches. At the bottom of the tunnel are 3 chambers, and offerings that include 4 large figurines of green stone, remains of jaguars, and jade statues. There are also significant quantities of liquid mercury, which may have represented an underworld river or lake. The area beyond has yet to be investigated and could hold the bodies of the earlier rulers of the city. PPPP. We already have discussed a few of the sites found in Central America, namely Palenque and Chichen Itza. In addition to them, some of the most recent and exciting discoveries in New World archaeology have been taking place at the Aztec site of Tenochtitlan, dating to about 1350 CE and located underneath downtown Mexico City, as well as at the site of Teotihuacan that we have just mentioned. Europeans have known about these sites since the Spanish invasion of Mexico in the 16th century. But those early Spanish invaders didn't know of the Olmecs. Let's start back in the 1930s and 1940s, with the discovery of the Olmec civilization. The Olmecs created the earliest known civilization in what is now modern Mexico, flourishing from at least 1150 BCE until about 400 BCE. Ironically, they were the last of the Mesoamerican civilizations to be discovered by modern archaeologists. The general public remembers them now primarily for the 17 giant stone heads and other sculptures that they have left us. It was Matthew and Marion Sterling, Smithsonian archaeologists, and a National Geographic photographer named Richard Stewart who first brought the Olmecs to the attention of the world. These archaeologists were not the first Westerners to have come across evidence of this civilization. The first known sculpture that can giant heads, feathered serpents, and golden eagles 305 be attributed to the Olmecs was published already in 1869. It had been discovered a few years earlier by a local worker on a farm in Veracruz, on the Caribbean coast of Mexico, near the village of Tres Zapotes. The name of the village is now also used for the nearby Olmec site where the farmer found the sculpture. As the story goes, the farmer thought at first the object was an overturned iron cauldron, but to his surprise it turned out to be a colossal head made of volcanic stone. The face is squat, with large eyes, nose, and lips. A helmet, which looks a lot like an early football helmet made of leather, covers the top of the head and down to the eyebrows. There is nothing below the chin, no neck, no body, no arms, and no legs. There is just the head. Because it looks about as wide as it is tall, it basically resembles a large carved billiard ball, except not quite so round. It was later re-excavated by Matthew Stirling in 1939 and is now known as Tracesupot's Monument A. As was often the case, initial discussions, and even some more recent discussions, of these giant heads and of the Olmecs in general sought to link them to Egypt, Phoenicia, people from Atlantis, ancient astronauts, and even China and Japan. They are, of course, not related to any of the above, but are indigenous to the region. The name Olmec, or Olmeca, means the people of the rubber country. It's not what they called themselves, but rather is what the Aztecs called their archaic descendants who still lived in the same general region at the time of the Spanish conquest in 1521. Archaeologists have taken to calling this region Olmen, meaning the rubber country, basically, the hot and humid area of the lowlands that stretch from modern southern Veracruz to western Tabasco. At the moment, we have no idea what their name actually was, since the few written records carved on stone left to us by the Olmecs have not yet been translated. The Stirlings and Stewart were also not the first archaeologists to explore the region. That honor goes to a two-person expedition from Tulane University in New Orleans, Franz Blom and Oliver Lafarge, who had set out in 1925 to search for more remains of the Maya. Instead, they found the remains of the Olmecs, including at what is now one of the best-known sites, La Venta, where they discovered another colossal. 306 Chapter 18. Stone head, altars, stelae, and the remains of a pyramid completely overgrown by the jungle. Their findings were published in 1926-1927 as a two-volume set titled Tribes and Temples. pppp. The three most important Olmec sites that have been excavated so far are San Lorenzo, Tresepotes, and La Venta. In almost every instance, the first archaeologists, and sometimes the later ones retracing their steps, were led to the sites by locals who had uncovered the stoneheads, altars, and other remains while farming. Tresepotes was the first of these to be professionally excavated, by a small team led by the Stirlings and including an archaeologist named Philip Drucker, from 1938 to 1940. They re-excavated and thoroughly documented the original Olmec head that had been found by the farm worker some 80 years earlier. It turned out that the head stands. Olmec colossal stone head, San Lorenzo. Giant heads, feathered serpents, and golden eagles 307. Nearly 5 feet high and weighs approximately 8 tons. They also found several other carved stone stelae and monuments, including one that had a date inscribed upon it, just like the Maya stelae at various sites like Copan and Palenque, which used a similar dating system. Stirling was able to quickly determine that the date on Stela C was the equivalent of our 31 BCE. In 1940, during their second season of excavating at Tresepotes, the Stirlings went to visit the second Olmec site, La Venta, which they knew from the published volumes of Blom and Laforge. They were looking for the 8 monuments that the 2 earlier archaeologists had been shown by the locals and had documented in a single day, back in 1925. They found them, including the colossal head, which turned out to be 8.5 feet high and 22 feet in circumference, plus 2 stelae, and 3 altar thrones, which generally have a carving of a seated person inside a niche on the front of the altar. The Stirlings found other remains that the previous explorers had not discovered, including 3 more huge stone heads and another altar throne on which the seated man holds a baby on his lap. There are also 4 more pairs of adults and babies on the same monument, which is why it is usually called the quintuplet altar, although its official name is simply Altar 5. As a result of all these discoveries during what had simply been a visit to the site, the Stirlings and Drucker decided to return and conduct excavations at La Venta in 1942-1943. Although World War II was raging at the time, they managed to fit in 2 short field seasons, during which time they excavated the mounds that could be seen at the site. Some mounds contained tombs with a few grave goods, others were covering mosaic pavements. Subsequent excavations by other scholars have yielded much additional material. La Venta has at least 30 earthen mounds that date between 1000 and 400 BCE, and archaeologist Richard Deal estimates that approximately 90 stone monuments have now been found at the site. In 1945, the Sterlings went to visit San Lorenzo, in southern Veracruz. There the locals immediately showed them two colossal stone heads. One was nearly 9 feet tall, the other was even taller, 9.4 feet tall. Each weighs approximately 40 tons. Both were larger than any the Sterlings had seen or found previously at either Tresapotes or La. 308 Chapter 18. Venta. They also saw about a dozen other stone monuments, all now identified as Olmec. In addition, they were shown two stone jaguars at the nearby village of Tenochtitlan. Archaeologists frequently tie these neighboring sites together, referring to them collectively as San Lorenzo Tenochtitlan. A subsequent field season in 1946 by Sterling and Drucker yielded a few more stone sculptures, but nothing extraordinary, and they never fully published their results. It was left to Michael Coe, of Yale University, to return to San Lorenzo in the mid-1960s and restart the excavations, which were then published. The most recent expedition, led by enciphers of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, worked at the site from 1990 to 2012. As a result of his work at the three sites, Matthew Sterling proposed that the Olmec civilization was older than that of the Maya, which initially met with fierce resistance from some of the old-school Mayanists, such as Eric Thompson. After all the debate, however, and with the introduction of radiocarbon dating, it was finally accepted that Sterling was correct and the Olmecs have now been placed in their proper and rightful position among the Mesoamerican civilizations. Although there is still much work to be done in elucidating the details. PPPP. In contrast, the discoveries that have been made in downtown Mexico City date to the much later period of the Aztecs. These have revealed previously unknown remains of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital city. The Aztecs were composed of a number of groups. Those who settled at Tenochtitlan called themselves the Mexica. The city flourished from about 1325 CE until its destruction by the Spanish conquistadors in 1521. Of course, it's always been known that the Aztec capital lies underneath Mexico City, because the Spaniards destroyed much of it before building their own city right on top of the ruins. Fortunately, the conquistadors created maps, including one supposedly drawn by Hernán Cortés himself, that show what the city looked like before its destruction. As a result, we know that it was originally built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, with causeways, giant heads, feathered serpents, and golden eagles 309. Connecting it to the mainland. The space available for living was expanded by creating chinampas, or floating gardens, which eventually became firmly enough anchored and covered with enough soil that houses and other structures could be built upon them. It looks like the city was then split into 4 quarters and may have housed as many as 250,000 people. Because the modern city covers the ancient one, buildings and artifacts are constantly being discovered during various construction projects. For example, the Great Calendar Stone, often called the Sunstone, was discovered in December 1790, when the Mexico City Cathedral was being repaired. This huge stone is almost 12 feet across and weighs about 24 tons. It's not quite clear what it was used for, though it may have been a ceremonial basin or altar. On it are depictions of the 4 periods that the Aztecs thought preceded their own time, lasting a total of 2,028 years. The face in the middle might be the Aztec deity of the sun, which is why some people call it the Sunstone. The Great Stone was probably originally located on or in the Great Temple, usually called the Templo Mayor. Portions of the Templo Mayor itself were originally found in the mid-1900s, with more accidentally discovered in 1978 when electric cables were being laid in the area. As British archaeologist Paul Bond notes, the excavation project that was subsequently undertaken was mammoth. Several entire city blocks of houses and shops were torn down in the very center of the city so that the archaeologists could investigate the remains. An archaeologist with the wonderfully appropriate name of Eduardo Matos Moctezuma led the team. The Templo Mayor is actually a double pyramid dedicated to 2 gods, Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun as well as war and human sacrifice, and Tlaloc, who is the rain and water god. In addition to the remains of the temple pyramid, the archaeologists found artifacts of gold and jade and many animal skeletons, and a rack of human skulls carved in stone. They also found that the Aztecs had buried objects from previous Mesoamerican civilizations. In 2006, archaeologists found a stone altar depicting Tlaloc that dates to about 1450 CE. They also uncovered a monolith, a stone slab, made of pinkish andesite. The monolith depicts the earth goddess Tlaltecutli, originally painted with ochre, red, blue, white, and black. 310 Chapter 18. It was found lying flat, but would have stood 11 feet tall when vertical. It weighs 12 tons and dates to the last Aztec period, 1487-1520. The team that discovered the monolith thought that it might still be in its original position, perhaps at the entrance to a chamber or even a tomb, even though it had broken into 4 large pieces. 2 years later, in a stone-lined shaft lying right beside the monolith, the archaeologists began finding additional Aztec religious offerings, including sacrificial knives made of white flint, objects made of jaguar bone, and bars of copal, or incense. Beneath the offerings, in a stone box, were the skeletons of 2 golden eagles, surrounded by 27 sacrificial knives, most of which were dressed up in costumes as if they were gods and goddesses. And beneath these were yet more offerings. By January 2009, the archaeologists had found 6. Aztec moon goddess, Tenochtitlan. Giant heads, feathered serpents, and golden eagles 311. Separate sets of offerings in this one deep pit, which reached 24 feet below street level. Back up at the 8-foot deep mark, the archaeologists had found a second stone box. It contained the skeleton of a dog or a wolf that had been buried with a collar made from jade beads. It also had turquoise plugs, like earrings, in its ears and bracelets with little gold bells around its ankles. The archaeologists promptly nicknamed it Aristocanine. The skeleton is covered with seashells and other remains of marine life, like clams and crabs. The lead excavator of the dig, Leonardo Lopez Lujan, thinks that the 6 sets of offerings mark the Aztec cosmology or belief system. For example, the dog wolf with the seashells would represent the first level of the underworld, serving to guide its master's soul across a dangerous river. As Robert Draper wrote in the 2010 National Geographic story that documented this amazing find, Lopez Lujan believes that he may be close to finding the tomb of one of the last, and most feared, Aztec emperors, Ahuitzotl, who died in 1502 or 1503. PPPP. Travel about 50 kilometers northeast of Tenochtitlan and we reach Teotihuacan. The site predates Aztec civilization, although the Aztecs gave the city its name, which may mean the birthplace of the gods. It was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1987 and is now one of the most visited tourist sites in Mexico. It's still a matter of debate who lived there and what they called their city. It was inhabited from about 100 BC to about 650 CE, as noted above, and probably had a population of up to 150,000 people when it was at its largest. In an interview published in October 2015, Professor David Carrasco of Harvard University described it as the Imperial Rome of Mesoamerica. By this, Carrasco means that Teotihuacan influenced hundreds of other Mesoamerican communities during its period of greatness and served as a beacon for later civilizations. Extensive evidence of Teotihuacano presence is seen in the Maya regions of southern Mexico and Guatemala hundreds of miles to the south, with many scholars believing that Teotihuacan controlled this region for several centuries. 312 Chapter 18. It used to be thought that the Toltecs built the site, because that's apparently what the later Aztecs told the Spaniards when they arrived, but that doesn't seem to have been factually accurate, because the site is earlier than the time of the Toltecs, who flourished during the 10th through 12th centuries CE. For the moment, the inhabitants are simply referred to as Teotihuacanos. A long central avenue dominates the site. Called the Avenue of the Dead, it runs for about a mile and a half. Along it, pyramids and temples were built. These include the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon, as well as the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. The Pyramid of the Sun is the largest of the buildings, more than 700 feet wide at the base and more than 200 feet tall, and has a ceremonial cave right under the pyramid, which was discovered in 1971. The Pyramid of the Moon is not far behind in size. Human remains were found there in the renewed excavations that began in 1998, which revealed a burial chamber with rich grave goods, including pyrite mirrors and obsidian blades. The Temple of the Feathered Serpent is the third largest building at the site. It gets its name from the heads of the feathered serpents that stick out from the facade of the building, each weighing up to 4 tons. The building itself probably dates to about 200 CE. Beginning in the 1980s, a series of pits was found in front of the temple, which contained the bodies of nearly 200 warriors, both male and female, and their attendants. All of them had their hands tied behind their backs and were obviously ceremonial victims, perhaps sacrificed at the time that the building was dedicated or during ceremonies held on various occasions. It was here that the secret tunnel was detected in 2003, leading from one of the plazas near the edge of the city to the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. As mentioned, investigation of this tunnel continues today. Some have suggested that it may lead to a royal tomb, perhaps holding the bodies of the earliest rulers of the city. Extensive survey work also has been done at the site and surrounding region. Headed by René Millen, the Teotihuacan Mapping Project documented the presence of huge industrial and domestic areas, conscious city planning, and ethnic communities from different parts of Mexico. The maps and other data produced by this project by 1973. Giant Heads, Feathered Serpents, and Golden Eagles 313. Provided archaeologists with a broader picture of the city's size, scope, and wealth, beyond just describing the pyramids and other major buildings. It is not clear why, but Teotihuacan was eventually abandoned, probably sometime in the 7th or 8th century CE. Even so, its location was never forgotten, even after it had been lying in ruins for centuries. We know, for example, that the Aztecs used to come to Teotihuacan and were well aware of the people who had once lived there. Of course, even these Teotihuacanos are not the oldest inhabitants of the region that we now call Mexico. As we have seen, that designation goes to the Olmecs, who built sites such as San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes, not to mention the Zapotecs in Oaxaca, who inhabited places like Monte Alban from about 400 BC to 700 CE. We also mustn't forget the Maya, whom we have discussed in another chapter and who should be placed between the Olmecs and the Aztecs. This region has a rich history, which is only just now beginning to be fully understood and further explored. In 1995, a Confederate submarine called the H.L. Hunley was discovered just off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. 130 years earlier, during the Civil War in February 1864, the Hunley had become the first submarine anywhere to sink an enemy ship in battle. The target ship was the USS Housatonic. The Hunley didn't so much fire its torpedo, but rather rammed the Housatonic, piercing its side with the torpedo's 16-foot-long metal spar, like a long harpoon, at the front of the sub. The torpedo was left stuck inside the ship, as designed. It was long thought that the crew then backed off about 150 feet before detonating the torpedo via a rope that pulled a trigger on the attached torpedo. Recent evidence, however, indicates that they may have had difficulty detaching from the Housatonic and were only about 20 feet away when the torpedo exploded, so the Hunley may have been destroyed in 19. Submarines and Settlers, Gold Coins and Lead Bullets. Submarines and Settlers, Gold Coins and Lead Bullets 315. The same detonation. The Confederates also may not have figured on the concussion shockwave caused by the detonation, or else the detonation may have knocked a latch on the forward conning tower loose, since it was found unsecured. In any case, when the torpedo went off, the Housatonic promptly sank off Sullivan's Island near Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, but so did the Hunley, in 30 feet of water and with all 8 men still on board. The sub had already sunk twice before, with both crews lost, while practicing for the attack, but this time it was lost for good, at least until 1995. The excavation of the Hunley is a good example of historical archaeology, which is what archaeologists call archaeological work related to events in the modern world since 1500. In most cases, there are historical records of these same events. Archaeologists provide a different lens on these incidents, enriching and often contradicting the written records. In the case of the Hunley, when the conservation and excavation of the submarine is complete, archaeology may help solve the mystery of why the Hunley sank and provide much more information on its construction and operation and a wealth of knowledge about the crew members, little of which was recorded in written records. The Hunley also is a good example of an excavation that was conducted under the Abandoned Shipwreck Act of 1987, which was signed into law in 1988. The act is meant to stop the looting of shipwrecks that sank in either state or federal waters, whether in Lake Michigan, the Potomac River, or off the coast of Florida. It gives authority to the federal government and to the state in which the wreck was found. Thus, the Hunley is in the jurisdiction of South Carolina, because the submarine was discovered 7 years after the act was signed into law and wasn't raised for another 5 years after that, in 2000. Credit for finding the sub is usually given to the novelist Clive Cussler and his team. South Carolina established the Hunley Commission, which serves as the custodian, meaning that it negotiates the details about its recovery, curation, and exhibition. Today, the original submarine is on display in North Charleston, where it is kept in a 90,000-gallon tank of freshwater to help remove salt that has permeated the small spaces. 316 Chapter 19. Between the metal components of the vessel and to prevent additional corrosion. The 40-foot-long sub was found on its side, at a 45-degree angle, sunken into the silt of the seafloor, 30 feet below the water surface. According to Dave Conlon, the archaeological field director, analysis of the sediments covering the Hunley showed that natural processes probably buried it within 30 years of sinking. Raising it involved a lot of people and a neat feat of engineering, requiring a hammock of straps below the submarine that was attached to a hoist to bring it to the surface. Once it was safely in the freshwater tank in the laboratory, excavation inside the vessel began almost immediately. The first human remains, 3 ribs, were found soon after, as were scraps of textile, part of a belt, and a corked glass bottle. The matrix of silt had protected the remains from the currents and the seawater, and the relative lack of oxygen had preserved skeletal material from the bodies as well as other artifacts. Excavation and investigation of the Hunley has continued ever since. By now, the complete skeletons and skulls of all 8 men have been recovered. Every one of them was found still sitting at his post, meaning that death might have been fairly instantaneous, or that they might have become incapacitated and drowned in place. One of the crew members, Joseph Ridgway of Talbot County, Maryland, has been positively identified through a DNA match made in 2004. Another, the commander, Lieutenant George E. Dixon, also has been identified, though more circumstantially. Dixon was known to have kept an engraved $20 gold coin with him at all times as a good luck charm. A young girl had given it to him, some reports say it was his fiancée. It had saved his life earlier, when he had been shot at the Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee and the bullet hit the coin instead of killing Dixon. The archaeologists excavating the Hunley found such a coin, with a deep indentation from a bullet and inscribed with the word Shiloh, April 6, 1862, my life preserver. GED, near the remains of a crewman. Later they found that the skeleton of that same crew member had a healed bullet wound in the left upper thigh, with pieces of lead and flecks of gold still embedded in his femur. These were most likely from the bullet and the coin, respectively, and it's pretty clear that this must. Submarines and settlers, gold coins and lead bullets, 317. B. Dixon's body. They also found his pocket watch, as well as a wallet, a bandana, matches, and tobacco pipes. The remains of Ridgway, Dixon, and the other crew members were ceremoniously buried in Magnolia Cemetery in Charleston in 2004. As Conlon has noted, the recovery of the Hunley represents a model of federal, state, and private sector united in service to an archaeological resource of extraordinary importance. UNESCO has now also begun efforts to protect underwater finds around the world by passing the Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage in 2009. The convention came into play in an interesting way 2 years later, when the Smithsonian was planning an exhibit that would have displayed objects from an Arab wreck that sank in the Java Sea in the 9th century CE. The shipwreck contained priceless artifacts from the Chinese Tang dynasty but was not excavated by professional archaeologists. Rather, the artifacts were recovered by a private company and later sold to another company for a reported $32 million. 3 different archaeological associations, as well as several members of the Smithsonian's own internal research unit, protested the proposed exhibition, saying that the process by which the artifacts had been recovered was closer to looting than to proper archaeological excavation. In the end, in the face of the protests, the exhibit was first postponed and then finally simply cancelled before it ever even opened. PPPP. If we now move up the east coast from South Carolina, we come to the excavations at Jamestown, Virginia. These excavations have been under the direction of William Kelso since the 1990s. They are an excellent example of traditional excavation methodology now enhanced by cutting-edge technology. Jamestown was the first permanent settlement to be established by British colonists, in what would later become the Commonwealth of Virginia. About 100 men, who had a very rough time during the first few years, began the settlement in 1607. Reinforcements, including some women, arrived a few years later. It is probably most well known to people today because of Pocahontas, the native. 318 Chapter 19. American woman who reportedly saved the life of Captain John Smith and then married a colonist named John Rolfe. The events are usually pitched as an improbable love story in the face of overwhelming odds, the Disney movie of the same name being one example. When Rolfe later returned to England for a visit, along with a new strain of tobacco that he had developed, he brought Pocahontas with him. The visit had a sad result, for she died while they were in England. The site of Jamestown had pretty much vanished over the centuries. Before Kelso began his excavations, he had only a little information to work with, mostly gleaned from archives stored in a library. It is the writings of Captain Smith and others, that is, eyewitness accounts, as well as a small sketch of the site by a Spanish spy and a single church tower, made of brick and dating from a later period, that led Kelso to determine where to place the first trenches. His archaeological intuition was excellent, and within hours of beginning their excavations, his team had found the first artifacts and remains of buildings. What did they find? Right away they came up with weapons and armor, as well as pottery, glass, coins, and other artifacts dating to the 17th century. They also found a line of post holes, which was all that remained of the wooden protective palisade wall belonging to the original fort. The wooden posts had long since disintegrated, but the holes in the ground dug to hold the posts were still plainly visible. As the excavations continued over the years, they found the rest of the outline of the whole fort, as well as the remains of 5 additional buildings, including the church, the governor's house, the barracks, and a workshop or trading post. By 2007, when Kelso published a brief description of their findings, they also had found numerous graves and skeletons in a variety of places, more than 70 of the interments in a cemetery, and also single graves underneath the church. The skeletal remains indicated that the men had mostly died before the age of 25. The women didn't live much longer than that. It was 4 skeletons in particular, though, that caught Kelso's interest. The 4 bodies had been found in November 2013, in the area of the church where Pocahontas and John Rolfe were married, which Kelso's team had uncovered earlier. The skeletal material was not well preserved, and so the effort to identify them involved the use of chemical testing and submarines and settlers, gold coins and lead bullets. 319. High-resolution micro-CT scanning. By late July 2015, the media reported, rather breathlessly, that the remains had been positively identified as belonging to some of the early leaders of the colony. According to some of those media reports, the skeletons had been taken to the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, where biological anthropologist Doug Owsley worked on them. Owsley, who also teaches classes to some of our George Washington University students, is world famous and has worked on many such cases, including the skeletons from the Hunley that we just discussed. Owsley and his team were able to identify the Jamestown skeletons using a combination of forensic analysis and historical records. The historical records allowed them to determine who had died between January 1608, when the church was constructed, and 1617, when it fell into disrepair and was moved. This narrowed down the list of possible suspects. The forensic analysis gave them the approximate age at death and the gender for the remains of the 4 skeletons. They also did chemical testing to determine the diet and such things as the level of lead in the bones. The results indicated that the dead people were most likely English and of high status, because of their high-protein diet and their exposure to things like pewter bowls and glazed pottery, both of which contain lead. Their high status, or at least their importance in the colony, also was indicated by the fact that their graves were found under the chancel of the church, that is, the space around the altar at the eastern end of the church, rather than in the unmarked cemetery located elsewhere. All 4 were men. 2 were from the original group of immigrants that arrived in 1607. They were Captain Gabriel Archer, who went looking for gold and silver in the hinterland of the settlement before his death at about the age of 35 in 1609 or 1610, and Reverend Robert Hunt, the first chaplain of the settlement. who died at the age of 39 after less than a full year at Jamestown. The other two were from the group of reinforcements who arrived in 1610. These are Ferdinando Wainman, who was around 34 years old when he died, reportedly of disease, just a few months after arriving, and his relative, Captain William West, who was killed by the Native Americans in 1610, also just a few months after arriving, when he was only about 25 years old. 320 Chapter 19. Kelso and his team also uncovered some human bones in 2012 that they thought were unusual and merited further investigation. The bones included fragments from a mutilated and incomplete skull, teeth, and the lower jaw, and a severed leg bone, a tibia, to be precise. Kelso found them in the cellar of a Jamestown house, in a context with the discarded bones of butchered horses and dogs, which is a rather unusual and unexpected location, to say the least. He called in Owsley to look at the remains. Owsley identified the bones as belonging to a young woman, specifically a young English girl about 14 years old, based on the development of her third molar and the growth stage of her shin bone. They nicknamed her Jane. Although they couldn't determine her identity or her cause of death, because there were so few bones, Owsley and his associates noticed that the bones exhibited unusual cut marks. There were 4 shallow cuts on her forehead, which the forensic anthropologists identified as an initial attempt to crack open her skull, according to the Smithsonian Insider online newsletter. The back of her head was then hit with a hatchet or a cleaver in a series of blows. The last one split her head open, presumably providing access to her brain. They also noticed that the lower jaw, or mandible, had punctures and sharp cuts on its bottom and sides. These, they said, were the result of efforts to remove tissue from the face and throat using a knife. From this evidence, Owsley, Kelso, and others have concluded that Jane died during the so-called starving time, the bleak winter months of 1609-1610, when the colony was ravaged by hunger and disease and almost failed before the reinforcements arrived. They also think that the other colonists ate her after she died. The evidence shows that the colonists were desperate enough at that time to resort to cannibalism. The forensic scientists also created a reconstruction of her head, using CT scans and other technology. The reconstruction was on display for a while at the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., and the original skeletal remains are presented at Historic Jamestown, the educational tourist center operated by the Jamestown Rediscovery Project on Jamestown Island. PPPP. Submarines and Settlers, Gold Coins and Lead Bullets, 321. Doug Owsley provides us with a nice connection that takes us from the East Coast all the way across North America to Washington State. That's because Owsley was also responsible for examining the almost 9,000-year-old skeleton of what is known as Kennewick Man to archaeologists and as the ancient one to the local Native American tribes. The skeleton has been the subject of a great deal of debate since its discovery in 1996, near Kennewick, Washington, by the banks of the Columbia River. In particular, the discovery of Kennewick Man has stoked the controversy that has always surrounded the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, which is perhaps the best-known piece of U.S. legislation that has involved archaeology in the past several decades. NAGPRA requires every federally funded U.S. museum and similar institution to provide an inventory of all their Native American artifacts, including human remains, funerary objects, grave goods, and so on. Each institution with such artifacts or remains had to determine whether any living Native American tribes could claim a relationship with the inventoried objects. If so, then the institution was required to offer to repatriate to the tribe whatever it was. These included things like Ishi's brain, which belonged to the last known Native American still living in the wilds of California. Ishi, a member of the Yahi tribe, had emerged from hiding in 1911 and was an instant media sensation. Berkeley anthropologist Alfred Kroeber is perhaps best known for his work with Ishi, and Alfred's wife Theodora, also an anthropologist, published a very popular book about him, Ishi in Two Worlds. Ishi also had a lot of interaction with a doctor named Saxton Pope, who was at University of California, San Francisco. Pope was an avid bow hunter. He befriended Ishi, who taught Pope how he made bows and arrows. Pope subsequently wrote and published a book in 1923, entitled Hunting with the Bow and Arrow, which is still highly regarded today. After Ishi's death in 1916, his brain was sent to the Smithsonian Warehouse in Suitland, Maryland, where it was kept in a sealed tank. When NAGPRA was passed in 1990, Ishi's brain was repatriated and reunited with his cremated remains in California. NAGPRA also came to the forefront when Kennewick Man was found in the Columbia River, reportedly by 2 college students who 322 Chapter 19 were wading in the river while watching boat races in late July 1996. The initial discovery was part of his skull, which was found about 10 feet from shore. At first it was thought he might have been a murder victim, and so the coroner and a local archaeologist named James Chatters searched for more parts, quickly turning up almost his entire skeleton. It eventually was discovered that he died about 8,500 years ago. Kennewick Man has been the subject of litigation almost since the moment he was found, with Native American groups arguing that he was Native American and should be repatriated to them, and a number of prominent scholars arguing that he was not Native American. Because the remains were too old to be related to any of the current tribes and should be cared for by the federal government because his remains were found on federal land. The case was settled in 2002 and affirmed by an appeals court in 2004, in favor of the scholars. The bones were kept in the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture in Seattle, Washington, during the decade-long legal dispute between a group of 8 archaeologists, 5 Native American tribes, and the federal government. They are not on display but were made available for study by scholars after the court decision. The case is still being debated. Most recently, in 2015, geneticists from the University of Copenhagen and elsewhere published an article in Nature, which compared the DNA of Kennewick Man to that of members from the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation and concluded that he is more closely related to modern Native Americans than he is to anyone else. On the basis of that publication, and a subsequent independent validation of those findings by scientists at the University of Chicago, it was decided in late April 2016 that Kennewick Man was to be repatriated and eventually buried by a coalition of 5 Native American tribal bands, including the Colville PPPP. If we move from the Pacific Northwest to the American Southwest, we find breathtaking Native American sites like Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. The canyon is a National Historical Park near Albuquerque that was named a UNESCO Heritage Site in 1987. It has amazing ruins, submarines and settlers, gold coins and lead bullets, 323. Built there by the ancestral Pueblo people, which date to between 850 and 1250 CE. At Chaco Canyon are a number of what are referred to as great houses, huge structures with multiple rooms and multiple stories. One of the best examples is Pueblo Bonito, which had between 600 and 800 rooms and was 5 stories tall. It was built in stages between 850 and 1150 CE. It covers 3 acres, but scholars are uncertain how many people lived there. Estimates range from about 800 to several thousand. It is also not completely clear whether it was a ritual center or a thriving village. The Chicoan culture, as it is now called, covered portions of New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Arizona. Imported goods that have been found there, including seashells and copper bells, attest to trade with areas as far away as Mexico. It is unclear, however, why Chicoan culture disappeared by about 1200 CE, although drought and plague, possibly followed by migration, have been suggested. Mesa Verde National Park, Colorado. 324 Chapter 19. Other ruins can be seen at Mesa Verde National Park in southwestern Colorado. Within the park are nearly 5,000 individual sites that date between the 6th and 13th centuries CE. There are about 600 cliff dwellings there, which run the gamut from small storage rooms to impressively large villages with as many as 150 rooms. The ruins at Mesa Verde, which include the famous Cliff Palace, Longhouse, Spruce Tree House, and Balcony House, were named a UNESCO Heritage Site in 1978. Elsewhere, in the Midwest, about 10 miles northeast of St. Louis, Missouri, Cahokia Mounds is another UNESCO Heritage Site, as of 1982. Built by members of the Mississippian culture between 800 and 1400 CE, and with a population of as many as 20,000 inhabitants at its peak in about 1100 CE, the site consists of about 120 separate mounds, hence the colloquial name for those who lived here, the Mound Builders. covering at least 2,000 acres, and described as being larger than London was at the time. It is considered to be the largest pre-Columbian archaeological site in the United States. The biggest of the mounds, known as Monk's Mound, is almost 100 feet tall. It has been estimated that it took 22 million cubic feet of soil to create it. It covers 6 acres, making it slightly larger than the Pyramid of the Sun by the Moche capital city in Peru, and therefore entitled to be dubbed the largest prehistoric earthen structure in the New World, as it is called on the relevant UNESCO webpage. Most of the mounds are much smaller and were originally meant as platforms and foundations for public buildings, as well as for tombs, but still, the early European explorers and settlers could not believe that the local inhabitants built them. The first published report, by Henry Brackenridge in 1811, compared the mounds to the pyramids of Egypt, and, just as with the Maya before John Lloyd Stevens's publications, it was thought that foreigners, including possibly Phoenicians or Vikings, if not Egyptians or lost Israelites, must have built them. It is indeed impressive to consider what must have gone into the building of these mounds and the complex society that they represent. The mounds, of various sizes and shapes, are enduring reminders of a civilization that once stretched across the Mississippi Valley and the southeastern United States. If we had detailed written records left to us by the members of this society, as we do for the Maya and other new submarines and settlers, gold coins and lead bullets, 325 world civilizations, we would undoubtedly be even more impressed by the Native American inhabitants responsible for these remains. PPPP. There are also, of course, any number of other North American archaeological sites to visit, including Colonial Williamsburg and George Washington's Mount Vernon, both of which recreate the time period using reenactors and are aimed at informing the interested visitor. Both also occasionally welcome volunteers to help excavate at the sites. For those who want to actually participate in a formal excavation in the United States, there are plenty of opportunities. It is relatively easy to learn what's going on and to find a project on which one can volunteer. For instance, there is Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, near Mesa Verde National Park. There it is possible to participate in a number of archaeological programs, whether solo or with the entire family. A similar, well-established program exists at the Center for American Archaeology in Campsville, Illinois. A variety of other excavations welcome volunteers as participants. Most are listed in the Archaeological Fieldwork Opportunity Bulletin that is published online every year by the Archaeological Institute of America on its website. In any case, the wonderful diversity of the archaeological landscape of North America is clear, even just from our brief survey in this chapter, where our discussion has included a sunken submarine in South Carolina and a lost settlement in Virginia, brief mentions of the ruins in the American Southwest, finds in the Pacific Northwest, and mounds in the Midwest. No matter where on the continent one happens to be, there's something interesting buried in the dirt. I end this final digging deeper section. I would like to begin by answering another question that I am asked all the time, which has a short answer but is long on associated implications. The question is simply, do you get to keep what you find? The answer is very short, no. Whether you're working in your own country or in a country other than your own, that nation's antiquities department will have a set of rules. The best discoveries might go to a national or regional museum, as has been true throughout the history of archaeology, but most of the material will be put into bags and boxes and stored at the local university, museum, or some other place where graduate students and other scholars can come in and study the material during the months after the excavation. A 6 or 7 week field season can yield enough material for 2 years or more of study and published findings. Not only don't I get to keep what I find, but I don't think that other people should collect such items either. The consensus among scholars, DIGGINGDEEP, are 4. Do you get to keep what you find? Do you get to keep what you find? 327. Is that there is a direct correlation between private collecting and the looting of ancient sites all over the world. Looters wouldn't bother stealing things from archaeological sites if they had no place to sell them. More complex is the issue of museum collections, whether the British Museum, the Louvre, the Met, and other museums should return items that they obtained in the period of European colonialism in the 19th and 20th centuries to their original countries of origin, like the Elgin marbles, the bust of Nefertiti, and the Rosetta Stone. Museums have become much more careful in the past couple of decades to ensure that the objects they purchase have clear provenance, but many looted objects still are displayed in museums that were obtained decades ago when the rules were not as stringent. It is a moral, ethical, economic, and legal problem that cannot be easily resolved. It may be that case-by-case decisions would be best, but even that remains to be determined. However, right now we are seeing the greatest prevalence of looting of archaeological sites worldwide that has ever been documented, almost certainly fueled by demand from private collectors. The greatest opportunities for looted objects are places where the policing of ancient sites is difficult because of political instability, like Syria and Iraq at the moment. Of course, looting is nothing new. Some of the Egyptian pharaohs' tombs were looted in antiquity, perhaps even immediately after the pharaohs were buried. But now we are seeing an upsurge worldwide in Afghanistan, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, and even Peru and the United States. Ancient sites are now pockmarked with looters' pits. On a small scale, illegal digging for antiquities has always been a way of life in some areas and cultures, usually done by impoverished folks hoping to supplement their meager income in some way. It is hard to blame a Syrian villager who excavates cylinder seals to sell to a middleman in order to feed his family when shops are closed, fields are burned, and travel impossible. But now wholesale looting operations seem to have swung into action, including in Syria, where ISIS reportedly sponsored and actively participated in the antiquities trade, looting entire sites and destroying parts of others, such as Nimrud and the Mosul Museum. I was part of a delegation of observers who went to Egypt in May 2011, after the January Revolution of that year. We went to do some 328 digging deeper for ground truthing in order to see whether the fresh holes dug into the ground that my colleague Sarah Parkak thought she had spotted in satellite photographs were looting pits. They were. I know. I was there and have pictures. Results of our study were published in the journal Antiquity for others to use. In fact, looted Egyptian antiquities have shown up in auction houses in London and New York, just as looted Iraqi antiquities have. When the Iraq Museum in Baghdad was looted, some of the most famous pieces in the museum were stolen. Many were returned or have been recovered, but others are still missing. Some ended up on eBay, where I and anyone else could see them, until pressure mounted and such sales were forbidden. Despite this prohibition, some looted objects can still be found for sale on eBay. One of my favorite stories is of someone who was trying to sell a stolen Iraqi item. When examined closely, it turned out to be one of the replicas that had been for sale in the museum store. Colonel Matthew Bogdanos of the U.S. Army, who was put in charge of recovering the looting in Iraq. Do you get to keep what you find? 329? Items stolen from the Iraq Museum documents many of these stories in his best-selling book Thieves of Baghdad, which was published in 2005. The looting went far beyond the museum and extended to archaeological sites throughout Iraq, with reports of men armed with both shovels and machine guns illegally digging at sites across the country. At least one, the ancient city known as Ummah, has been so thoroughly looted that all that can be seen in the photographs are looters' pits, rather than ancient buildings or anything else. The appearance of one-of-a-kind looted objects can cause a dilemma for archaeologists committed to limiting the trade in illegal antiquities. Such seems to have been the case in 2011, when the Sulaymaniyah Museum in the Kurdistan region of Iraq was advised by an Assyriologist in Britain to buy a group of clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform that he had been shown by an antiquities dealer. In this case, among the tablets was one that turned out to contain a previously unknown section from the Epic of Gilgamesh. It fills in a large gap within the fifth tablet in the poem where Gilgamesh and his sidekick Enkidu are heading for the cedar forest to get timber. This is usually thought to be the same general region where the famous cedars of Lebanon mentioned in the Bible were located. The new lines describe the noises that they hear upon entering the forest, including birds, insects, and monkeys lost for 3,000 years. This tablet filled in an important piece of one of the classics of world literature. The dilemma for archaeologists, of course, is that we don't want to encourage looting, but also cannot allow such a tablet with valuable information to go into the art collecting market and disappear from public view without making some effort to save it and allow scholars to study it. Discussions on the issue have been prompted by the history of the Dead Sea Scrolls, many of which were purchased from the Bedouin who had illegally found them in the caves around Qumran, it is frequently asked what would happen if such scrolls appeared on the antiquities market today. In fact, there is something similar that has happened with more than 100, or perhaps as many as 200, clay tablets that apparently come from an archive that documents the daily life of Jews who were moved to Mesopotamia during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC and remained there into the 5th century BCE. The tablets appeared on the antiquities market at some point, reportedly. 330 Digging deeper 4. After the 1970s, though exactly when is debated. At least half were eventually purchased by a private collector and then published by a pair of scholars, after which they were displayed in an exhibit at the Bible Lands Museum in Jerusalem in early February 2015, from which came a second publication by a different set of scholars. Even though it is not clear from which site they came, the tablets give its ancient name as Al-Yahudu, which, roughly translated, means Judah town. They are among the first textual evidence from Mesopotamia confirming that the Babylonian exile reported in the Bible and elsewhere did take place and what happened to those who were exiled. The tablets are extremely important, but they have no known context and were obviously looted, perhaps from southern Iraq, according to some reports. Should they have been published? Should they have been put on display? In this case, the importance of the texts, like the Dead Sea Scrolls to which they have the best parallel in terms of circumstances of discovery, persuaded at least some scholars that they should be published and displayed, despite the fact that they were apparently looted and acquired illegally. Not all scholars agree. In fact, the Archaeological Institute of America's policy is to refuse to publish articles that describe objects that cannot be clearly demonstrated not to have been looted. PPPP. In 1970, UNESCO approved the Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Import, Export, and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Property, which was put into effect in April 1972. As a result, any antiquity that is being sold today needs to have valid proof that it was either found before 1970 or, if found later, that it was legally exported from its country of origin, in other words, verification that it wasn't looted. Obviously, this system is not foolproof and many more objects on the art market are purported to have been found before 1970 than after since the convention took effect, but on the whole, this was a good start. Clearly, looting, especially during or in the aftermath of a conflict, is by no means a new problem, but unique situations can sometimes. Do you get to keep what you find? 331. Necessitate new laws. Thus, additional legislation is now beginning to be passed, not only about artifacts found in the United States, but also for artifacts found elsewhere and smuggled into the United States. Lawmakers in the United States have been passing legislation aimed at preserving ancient sites and antiquities for more than a century now. In fact, one of the earliest laws on antiquities was passed during the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, trying to control the huge trade in looted painted pots and other antiquities illegally dug from graves on ancestral Pueblo sites in the U.S. Southwest. Known as the American Antiquities Act of 1906, it was aimed at stopping or at least controlling the looting in New Mexico, Arizona, and elsewhere, because sites like Casa Grande in Arizona, which dates to about 1350 CE, were being looted for wooden beams and other ancient remains. Other laws followed, including the Historic Sites Act of 1935, which gave the National Park Service the right to identify, protect, and preserve cultural property, such as Native American sites or sites from the colonial era. This responsibility of the National Park Service is in part why the National Park Service is the largest employer of professional archaeologists in the United States. Some of the most important pieces of archaeological legislation have been passed since 1979. These include NAGPRA, which we have discussed in a previous chapter, but also the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, which protects archaeological sites on federal land. Anyone who takes artifacts from such a site can be fined up to $20,000 and sent to jail for a year, which will also permanently place a felony on the offender's record. In one instance, federal agents arrested 16 people in Blanding, Utah, in 2009 for digging Native American artifacts out of nearby federal lands, later charging a total of 24 people in the case. Such legislation has affected everything from the discovery to the excavation to the preservation, conservation, and promotion of archaeological sites. The laws are designed to help, rather than to hinder, archaeologists and, in fact, along the way they have created innumerable jobs in archaeology, employed by states, cities, and the National Park Service and as cultural resource management archaeologists who often go in just ahead of the bulldozers on construction projects. 332 Digging Deeper 4. Most recently, and looking at current worldwide problems, the U.S. House of Representatives passed legislation in 2015 that makes it illegal in the United States to sell artifacts that have been looted from Syria. That legislation, now referred to as the Protect and Preserve International Cultural Property Act, was approved by the Senate in April 2016 and signed into law by the President on May 9, 2016. Similarly, a Memorandum of Understanding between the United States and Egypt was signed on November 30, 2016. This will place restrictions on incoming antiquities from Egypt to help curb the ongoing looting in that country. As far as I am concerned, and I believe that I speak for many of my fellow archaeologists as well, ancient artifacts are part of our collective heritage, and so we can only hope that the new legislation and agreements will help to curtail the looting going on around the world. More can and should be done, from passing legislation to guarding excavated sites and protecting known but unexcavated remains. Those outside the profession can help by not succumbing to the temptation of purchasing an ancient artifact offered in a Middle Eastern market or seen on eBay. Because everything that we excavate, study, and write about took place so long ago, the question that should concern all of us is how we can stem the loss of knowledge about our own shared past before it is too late. The concept of the past, that there are layers and layers of civilization and that each culture is in a very real sense built upon the cultures that came before it, is at the very heart of what archaeologists do. As we dig down through layers of dirt, we're not just uncovering objects. We're uncovering our deep connection to the past. And, of course, someday, we will be the past. Our civilization, our culture, will be long gone, and future archaeologists will be uncovering their connections to us. Our iPhones, Barbie dolls, Walmart stores, and McDonald's arches will all be the object of study by future archaeologists. Therefore, I'd like to take this opportunity to look forward into the future and try to address two issues. One is the question of how archaeologists will actually do archaeology in the future, that is, what new tools and techniques they will be using. The other is how archaeologists will interpret us, that is, our society and civilization, in the future. Let's look at this first. I've been talking about something that I call future archaeology ever since I saw two television shows that were made after Alan. Epilogue. Back to the Future. 334 Epilogue. Weissman published his best-selling book The World Without Us. One was shown on the National Geographic Channel and was called Aftermath, Population Zero. The other was shown on the History Channel and was called Life Without People. Both of them looked at what would happen to our cities and monuments in the coming years if we humans ceased to exist, as did Weissman's original book. The television shows included footage of the Eiffel Tower crumbling, the Space Needle in Seattle coming down, lions roaming the grounds of the White House, and the like. What would a team of archaeologists find 200 years from now if all humans disappeared today? What about in 2,000 years? How would they interpret what they find and how would they reconstruct our society, leaving aside for the moment all the big administrative buildings, schools, homes, highways, bridges, roads, airports, and so on? What would structures like the Washington Zoo or the Smithsonian Museums, or even Starbucks and McDonald's, look like? What would be found in their ruins? Would they be identified properly? That is, would Statue of Liberty, head. Back to the Future 335. It'd be obvious that one was once a zoo and one a coffee restaurant? And if they were misidentified, what would archaeologists think that they were? The zoo might cause a bit of a problem, unless one could still read the signs that were once posted everywhere. It would also depend upon whether all the animals had managed to escape, in which case all the cages would be found empty, or if they had been trapped inside and we found their skeletons. If one found the skeletons and could read the signs, it would be pretty obvious what it once was, but otherwise perhaps not. The Smithsonian Museums, or any large museum for that matter, like the Met in New York City or the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, will definitely cause problems until it dawns on the archaeologists that they are excavating a museum. Any building that has the Hope Diamond, dinosaurs, and a large whale is sure to cause much confusion and discussion until they realize that they have been excavating the National Museum of Natural History. Personally, though, I think it's going to be places like Starbucks and McDonald's that could cause the most confusion. Specifically, I think there is a good chance of misidentifying Starbucks as a religion, complete with a goddess wearing a crown and with flowing locks, and with her shrine or temple located on virtually every block or street corner. The same thing could be said for McDonald's, except in this case the deity being worshipped has a known name, Ronald McDonald, and has red hair and dresses in gaudy clothes. Or maybe we would conclude that these two stand at the head of a pantheon, like Zeus and Herod for the Greeks and Jupiter and Juno for the Romans? I jest, and yet, if enough relevant records do not survive, those could be the kind of interpretations made by future archaeologists. Already when we're on excavations and find something that we don't immediately understand, we half-jokingly call it cultic or religious. Future archaeology is interesting to think about, especially since we spend so much time looking at previously vanished cultures and don't usually consider what our culture is going to look like to future archaeologists. Consider, for instance, the fact that so many of our interactions are now online. Most of those interactions will vanish without a trace or will be inaccessible to future archaeologists, and so what will they? 336 Epilogue. Conclude about our rate of literacy, for instance? And if they find that things halted suddenly, just like they did in Pompeii back in 79 CE, what will they think about the ubiquitous rectangular blobs of metal, plastic, glass, and circuitry that seem to be associated with every skeleton? Including many that are found clutched in someone's hand? Will they have any idea that these once were communication devices? A similar thought experiment was already undertaken back in 1979, when David Macaulay published a great short illustrated book called Motel of the Mysteries. The premise of the book is this: life in North America is basically extinguished in a single day in 1985. Then, in the year 4022 CE, amateur archaeologist Howard Carson accidentally stumbles upon an ancient site, which turns out to be the Motel of the Mysteries. He then brings in a team to help him, including an assistant named Harriet Burton. Obviously, Howard Carson is based on Howard Carter, and his assistant Harriet Burton is based on the real-life Harry Burton, who was an Egyptologist and the photographer during Carter's very real excavation of King Tut's tomb. Macaulay has a lot of fun with references to the discovery of King Tut's tomb, including the famous phrase that Carter, or rather Carson in this case, utters, namely that he sees wonderful things. As it turns out, though he doesn't realize it, he has not discovered a tomb, although he does find two skeletons. Instead, he has found what we, the knowing readers, recognize is actually a motel room. The misinterpretations of what they find are hysterical and include many inside archaeological jokes, but it also illustrates what I just said a moment ago, that if we don't know what something is, we often think it might be religious. Thus, in the so-called outer chamber, Macaulay's Howard Carson finds everything facing the great altar, including the body that is still lying on top of the ceremonial platform and is still holding in its hand the sacred communicator. Of course, we recognize these. The great altar is none other than a television set, the ceremonial platform is just a bed, and the sacred communicator is the remote control for the television set. And yet, in this setting, 2,000 years after the fact and with nothing else to go on, Howard Carson interprets all this as religious. Macaulay tops it all off by having Harriet Burton put on and proudly wear the sacred headband and sacred collar that were still in place. Back to the Future, 337. On the sacred urn when they found them. The accompanying illustration makes it quite clear that she is, in fact, wearing a toilet seat around her neck as the sacred collar, and it is the strip of paper that says "sanitized for your protection" that is wrapped around her head as the sacred headband. Two toothbrushes are dangling from her ears as plastic ear ornaments, and she is wearing the rubber stopper for the bathtub drain as an exquisite silver chain and pendant. Even better, the drawing is a dead ringer for the famous photograph that Heinrich Schliemann took of his wife, Sophia, when she was wearing all the jewelry from Priam's treasure that he found at Troy. This is what it may come to when someone in the future excavates Starbucks, McDonald's, museums, zoos, and possibly even motels from our time. All humor aside, it is worthwhile thinking about the fact that our current culture may be wildly misinterpreted by future archaeologists and that we may occasionally, or perhaps even often, misinterpret the past. That is an occupational hazard, but usually, once enough data is found, we come to a scholarly consensus about the proper interpretation of a building or a site or even a civilization. PPPP. And what about how archaeologists will actually do archaeology in the future? That is, what new tools and techniques will they be using? Of course, we have absolutely no way of knowing the answer. Just as Heinrich Schliemann and Howard Carter could not have predicted the use of remote sensing techniques that have now been employed at both Troy and King Tut's tomb. I suspect that there will continue to be advances in technology, which will allow us to peer even more easily beneath the earth, or beneath the tree canopies in Central America and Cambodia, before we begin digging. For instance, I am absolutely convinced, and have been saying for years, that there must be a better way to conduct remote sensing. Apart from LiDAR, most of the techniques that we are using, such as magnetometers, resistivity, and so on, are now decades old. It is time for new advances. In fact, advances are already beginning to happen in some cases. For example, fluxgate gradiometers and cesium magnetometers have replaced proton magnetometers on some projects. As we 338 Epilogue have said before, using remote sensing can minimize the need for digging. Since archaeology is destruction, that would allow us to potentially destroy less and to do more work before ever breaking ground. I wonder, for instance, whether in the future it might be possible to detect things like plaster or other specific materials through a layer of earth, just as we can now detect buried walls and ditches. Could some of the techniques being used by the Transportation Security Administration in airports, for example, to catch drug runners and explosives, be repurposed to detect chemical compounds that would belong to artifacts still buried in the earth? And would it make sense to partner with gas and oil exploration companies to utilize new techniques that might allow us to peer deeper into the depths of a mound, or to do so in a series of slices at specific depths? I do think that the time is ripe for another series of technological breakthroughs, but I think it is also a matter of talking to the right engineering people, perhaps someone who would say, "Wait, you want to do what? Oh yeah, we can do that, no problem." I also think that we will see new analytical techniques coming from chemistry, biology, and especially DNA studies, such as are happening already. Conservation techniques also should continue to improve, so that we can preserve more of what we find. Above all, there should be greater sensitivity to community needs and community goals for archaeology, and an increase in collaborative projects between archaeologists and local communities, so that the people whose heritage is being explored have a greater say in what happens to the artifacts of that heritage. I also think that it is fairly safe to say that the actual process of physically digging, that is excavating with picks, shovels, trowels, and dental tools, will continue as it has since the very first days of archaeology. The number of ways that one can dig carefully and yet quickly, without destroying the remains, is limited. Still, I could be surprised, for some new digging techniques may be invented that I cannot even begin to imagine at the moment. What will not change is the archaeological axiom that the best things on a dig are always found on the last day of the excavation season. And almost always in the bulk. PPPP. Back to the Future 339. In my office at George Washington University, in addition to the book on Schliemann that my mother gave me twice, I also have 2 bumper stickers pasted on the wall. The first one says simply archaeology, I'd rather be digging. The second one says archaeologist. The coolest job on earth. I save the past, what do you do? Just as bumper stickers should, they encapsulate my feelings about archaeology in a nutshell. I really would rather be digging. But they also issue a challenge to the rest of the world. Archaeology is not only about finding the remains that have been left from past civilizations. It's also about preserving and curating those remains for future generations. I hope that this book lends itself, even in some small way, to that aim.